ESRS, CSRD, CS3D, SFDR. Mummy told us not to use four-letter words. What is this all about? Welcome to watch the sustainability trends in business. This time we will talk about sustainability regulation. And yes, there is a lot to talk about. Sustainability regulation is something that we don't like, but it's at the same time something that we sorely need, because regulation is actually what holds societies together. They are there to solve the tragedy of the commons, which is so common with environmental and social issues. In this episode, I will mostly concentrate on the EU regulation. The EU is, after all, a superpower of regulation. But what happens in the EU this year is something that is prone to happen in other geographic areas later on. This has happened with some EU regulations like GDPR, and this will most probably happen also with the sustainability regulation. The EU regulation shows where the world is going, whether or not we liked about it. The EU regulation can be seen as being under the umbrella of the Green Deal. Of course, there is the word green, which suggests that it's only an environmental thing, but it also has a lot of elements for social issues and also governance. So the full spectrum of ESG. This makes the regulation very broad, and it consists of several bits and pieces. The regulation framework is unarguably complicated, and not parts of it have even been tried because it's so new. Some of the regulation is not enforced yet, so it may change. And some of it is something that it only applies to 2026 and later. But here we can see the framework. The main building blocks are Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, and Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR. SFDR is for the financial sector. The basic idea is that if you have a fund where you want to have investors, then you have to tell the investors about the ESG footprint of your fund. So all financial instruments must tell about the environmental and social impact of the sort of products. This should be done in a transparent and comparable way so that you can compare different funds to make customers' decision making easier. And there are things like Article 6, Article 8, Article 9 funds, depending on how deep they go into ESG. The counterpart of SFDR, the sort of real-world counterpart, is CSRD. CSRD forces corporations to report their sustainability activities in a transparent way. And this is of course so that direct investors, so shareholders, can evaluate the sustainability performance, and of course the same metrics that companies report to their direct shareholders will be used as the basis for the SFDR financial players, funds and fund reports. There are a couple of more directives in this framework. Taxonomy regulation, also called Taxonomy, TR, lists environmentally good activities to make it easier to classify businesses. Then we have Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, or usually CS3D, which guides businesses to make a thorough due diligence, that is an evaluation, to their supply chains. CS3D, which I think sounds like a robot, is related to CSRD in the sense that while CSRD forces companies to report, CS3D forces companies to actively manage their operations and supply chains to be sustainable. And CSRD reporting is based on a set of standards which are called the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS. And the ESRS is released and maintained by EFRAG. I'm not going into deeper details there. And then there are two more slightly further away but important parts of this regulation, and they are the new Empowering Consumers Directive and Green Claims Directive. ECD has already entered into force in 2024, but as it's an EU regulation, it means that it's not yet in the national legislation. It will be there by 2026, so the first implications will be seen in 2026. ECD aims at preventing false claims regarding environmental or social aspects of products and services offered to consumers. So this is a consumer thing, B2C in that sense. And then Green Claims Directive, GCD, is about environmental claims, and it gives much more precise instructions, but it's important to understand that Green Claims Directive is not in force yet. It's in the large machinery called the EU legislative machine, and it's at an early stage, so there will be changes, but we don't know what kind of changes, so the scope might change. And of course, the intention of all this is good. If you take ECD, GCD, it's of course quite easy to understand that companies should not lie to customers. And it's also easy to understand that investors, if they want to make green investments, they need to have the information to make informed decisions on where to put their money. So transparency, fair competition, no cheating, no greenwashing, and more tools for consumers to make informed decisions. All this sounds good, but it's too early to say if it works. And does it feel a bit complex? Well, it does, and the EU's way of tackling complexity is usually to introduce complex legislation. There might be collateral damages and things that we have not been able to foresee. The EU legislative process is important to understand here because it involves the EU Parliament, Council and Commission. The Commission is the one that sort of creates the drafts and makes the initiatives, and then Parliament and Council in tandem, so parallel, then they try to see if those make sense and go through the political negotiations. There are a lot of stakeholders, there are a lot of lobbyists, of course, because these pieces of regulation have massive financial impact, and also a lot of ideology. So typically, Commission has a relatively balanced view, and of course it is prepared by professionals. There are a lot of bureaucrats preparing it, and they are not dumb, so they are usually quite balanced in that sense. Then the EU Parliament adds the ideological part, and that is also a national thing in some cases, and in some countries it is not the brightest politicians that are elected to the EU Parliament. And then we have the Council, which is formed by the ministers of governments of EU countries. The Council is unfortunately sometimes more about national politics than about what the EU is doing. And the result is scattered. For example, practically all pieces of this Green Deal legislation apply to different companies. CSRD and CS3D apply to large companies in principle, but there are businesses that only need to take one because they have different limits for sales, different limits for balance sheet, and so on. The Green Claim Directives may apply to all companies apart from micro companies, but we don't know it yet. The tendency has been that the lobbyists have been trying to push all this regulation towards larger companies. Well, I'm not boring everyone, and that is me included, by going through every piece of legislation, but I want to say a few words about CSRD, ESRS and Taxonomy, the numerical side of things, because they are important in creating sustainability. CSRD is a new thing. It applies mainly to listed companies, publicly listed companies. It had a predecessor, NFRD, Non-Financial Reporting Directive, but it turned out to be too vague. And this story, if you've been watching my ESG stories, then you know that ESG started as corporate social responsibility, which turned out to be too vague, and then we wanted to have ESG, which has the numerical side. And exactly the same thing is happening here. So from qualitative to quantitative. First reports, CSRD reports, will be out in 2025, spring 2025, and they will be about year 2024. Interestingly, the CSRD directive itself is half a page long. It has 2 very short clauses there. And the rest 240 pages are appendix or annex, the ESRS reporting standard. And the reporting is divided into general, E, S and G. So this is purebred ESG thinking, taking to the extreme, I'd say, because there are altogether over 1100 data points. Not all of them are mandatory for all companies, many of them are voluntary, it depends on the industry, but every company needs to report at least a couple of hundred data points. And of course, here we have the clear downside. It's difficult to compare because you have so many data points. The message will be lost in noise. And it is also a huge reporting work for companies. Right now, sustainability organizations of corporations are busy making these reports while they should be busy doing something about sustainability. And I think most probably that we have the wrong organizations taking care of it, because this is audited material which goes into the books with financial information, which means that most probably this should belong to the finance function, not to the sustainability function. This is reporting, this is not doing. And there is collateral damage, unfortunately. Now it seems that CSRD applies only to large companies, listed companies, having a lot of resources, so needing to spend €1 million to build a reporting system is not that big of a problem. But it's trickling down, because as larger corporations are collecting CSRD data, they need to collect it from their supply chains. And this means that the companies are sending out 100-page long forms for the smaller companies, for their subcontractors, SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to fill in for a large number of data points. And this is difficult for the SMEs. I don't know if there is a clear solution to this, because the corporations need to have that data, and the only way to get that data is through their supply chains, because the idea is that everything goes through that supply chain to the sort of final part of the supply chain, whether there is one or not. My thinking goes that larger corporations should try to help SMEs do this reporting, so make it as easy as possible, give education, give help, offer systems, because otherwise we're facing a future where large corporations only buy from large subcontractors. And that is not a happy future, because then a large part of the ecosystem of SMEs will die out. Or then there is of course the alternative that corporations start using subcontractors from the third countries, so countries outside of the EU, which can create and provide excellent documentation. Everything is great, and then reporting is fine. And I don't think if that is going to be a happy story either. Collecting the true data from the supply chains is next to impossible, I would say, if there are long chains, and especially industrial companies have long chains. It's not 1 or 2 subcontractors, but if you're buying a screw, then you have someone you have the wholesaler, you have someone who has manufactured a screw somewhere, and you have someone who has provided material, and someone who has provided material for the material, and then you have recycled materials, you have virgin materials from the mines, and so on. And in principle, with CSRD, companies are responsible for everything that happens in their supply chains. Well, now that I've been saying that CSRD might be a good idea, but the practical side is not that great, and it may not meet its goals. But there is one thing that is extremely good in CSRD, and that is called DMA, Double Materiality Assessment. It's a great opportunity. Double materiality sounds a bit bureaucratic, but the idea is that companies must have a look at their business from 2 different directions. One, how does my business impact the world? So what I do, what is my footprint, what is my handprint? And then the other direction, how do the changes in the world impact my business? What kind of risks and opportunities? And then we need to take two perspectives. Impact, that is the sustainability perspective, which goes into indirect and so on, and financial perspective, risks and opportunities. So, for example, we need to ask that if climate change changes something in the environment, somewhere in our supply chain, will that be a threat to us? That's a risk. Or we may also ask that, okay, if climate change forces the world to go that way and use that kind of technology, is that an opportunity for us? The whole package. And this is a highly strategic thing. I love this if this is done right, because it helps identifying opportunities, not only risks, but opportunities. And then on the other hand, if it's done by consultants, so that we tell that we just need to get it done quick so that we have the papers right, then forget about it, it's not of help. Okay, at this point, he feels like giving up, and I guess that he is reflecting the feelings of you remaining viewers at this point. Why a cat? Because everyone loves cat images and they lower blood pressure. But hey, bear with me for one more thing. As I said, the regulation is highly political. I give you an example. It's the taxonomy. So that was a regulation that sorts businesses into categories of great business and bad business sort of thing. There are 6 environmental objectives. So this is purely environmental. Mitigation of climate change, adaptation to climate change, sustainable use of water and marine resources, transition to circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and finally protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. All of these are splendid objectives, just great. It's difficult to disagree, but then the directive goes on and gives a full list of activities that are taxonomy eligible. And they are eligible if they have a positive impact on one of the items on that list of objectives. So, and if a business falls into this list, so it's eligible and it fulfills a couple of other requirements, it's taxonomy aligned, and that means that it is good business. And now I'll take Vaisala as an example because, of course, I happen to know that quite well. Vaisala is providing weather and climate measurements, instruments for industry to reduce the resource consumption in industries. What Vaisala says is the purpose is taking every measure for the planet and providing instruments and intelligence for climate action. Clearly something that should meet many of the goals in the list. So how much of this is taxonomy eligible and how much is aligned? Let's see. Well, the answer eligible, so the things that are found on the list of good things, is 13%. 13%. And that is because the only stuff on the list is wind sensing for wind energy, and then building HVAC, so building ventilation stuff, and measurements related to that. Other activities, be they weather measurements or climate measurements, they have not been listed in the taxonomy, so they can't be included. And when we go to taxonomy aligned, so we had 13% of eligible and we have exactly 0% taxonomy aligned. Why is that? Because these tend to be electrical equipment, so they have electronics in them, and there is something called the DNSH, do no significant harm. So an activity to be taxonomy aligned needs to be something that it does not do any significant harm to a list of things. So it must not include some harmful chemicals and so on. And the interesting thing here is that if you have anything that has electronics in it, it's impossible to verify. Because you have the chip manufacturers, large multinational corporations, and when you go to them and say that we are buying this and this processor, we would like to have your report that you haven't been using substances that fall into the DNSH list, what they tell is that, well, you have the option of not buying the components. And these are some of the largest companies in the world. No way to get that information, no way to verify. Is this intentional? I don't think so. Is this collateral damage? I think so. And in contrast, to see where it goes political, is that burning Russian natural gas is in the list of taxonomy eligible, and it's most likely taxonomy aligned. And why is that? Because we all know that burning natural gas emits a lot of carbon dioxide. Well, this is because the French wanted to have nuclear power on that list, because nuclear power does not emit carbon dioxide. But the Germans, who hate nuclear power for some reason, then they said that no, you're not going to have that, and then the French and the Germans negotiated, and the result was that both Russian natural gas and nuclear power are on the list. Does this sound sensible from the scientific point of view? No, it doesn't make any sense, but it's called politics. And of course the result is that the investors don't care that much. They know this. They know that this taxonomy is, at least in its current form, something that doesn't really give any good answers. So it was watered down. We just report that it's not taxonomy aligned and our investors don't care. But okay, let's stop EU bashing here, however much I love it. Companies use other tools and guidelines as well, not only the EU regulation. Maybe the most commonly used is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the UN SDGs are divided into 17 categories, which you can see here. This, if you look at these, is much more aimed towards making the world a better place to live. Food, education, so on. All these goals have so-called targets under them. There are altogether 169 targets. For example, here are the targets for goal number 4, quality education. Such things as free primary, secondary education, inexpensive higher education, improving literacy, increase in general educational level, and so on. These are great targets. Whether or not these are business targets is one question, and another point is that these really seem to be geared towards the global south. And in the global humankind setting, it makes sense, and it should be that way, because the global south is bigger than us in the so-called Western countries. But what is the business implication? Of course, reflecting business outcomes on SDGs makes no harm, but they really are more common goals for the humankind, and they are more for the political decision makers than businesses. This is a great quote from the UN Global Compact. The UN Global Compact asks companies to first do business responsibly and then pursue opportunities to solve societal challenges through business innovation and collaboration. And I think this is a great piece of advice. So take care of your own stuff first, and then try to find opportunities to have an impact on the world. So the SDGs are not a tick-the-box to-do list. It's more or less businesses should read through and understand if there are places where they possibly can contribute. No business can contribute to all of the 17 targets or all 169 boxes in this list. Ticking one and not doing significant harm to the others is a great position. SDGs are often used as a marketing tool, and sometimes you can see that people have really been stretching their imaginations to be able to tick some of the boxes. But that's not the point. This is not a competition who has most of the boxes ticked. And the last 4-letter word, acronym for the day, SBTi, Science-Based Targets Initiative. It is what it says on the package. Companies set climate targets which can be verified by science, so that if everyone had such targets, we would stop at 1.5 centigrade warming. Of course, we know that we're not going to stop there, but if everyone did that. Setting the targets has a lot of technicalities, and it's a bit different for different industries. For example, aviation has a completely different set of rules from industry. And again, using Weisel as an example, Vaisala is part of the SBTi, and Vaisala's target is minus 52% of absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions and minus 52% of sales relative scope 3 by 2030. And what does that mean? Well, to understand this, you need to understand what are scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. And they come from the GHG, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it's a partnership between World Resources Institute and World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WRI and WBCSD. Never mind if you don't remember those, but the point is that this is a de facto standard for GHG emission reporting. Scope 1 is my own emissions, what comes directly out of my chimney. It's important for a power plant or a concrete manufacturer, for example, with high emissions. Then scope 2 is emissions for purchased energy. Electricity, heat, whatever I purchase and that sort of comes out of the wall. And then scope 3 is indirect, that is everything else. Scope 3 is split into upstream, so what we buy, what is coming to us, and downstream, use of our own products, that is what is going out of us, activities. It's often very complex to define, again, because of the complex nature of the supply chains. Vaisala, as an industrial company, has 99.4% of total emissions in scope 3. So scope 1, well, it's essentially zero. Scope 2 is very low as well. And what is important to understand is that, of course, scope 3, so the indirect emissions will be somebody's scope 1 emissions. So it will come out of somebody's chimney. Or scope 2 emissions. So it is due to someone in our supply chains buying energy. And of course, if we buy energy, so our scope 2 emissions are somebody's scope 1 emissions. So these are not comparable. 1, 2 and 3 are different things. Scope 1 are the direct emissions, and you can add all of them together in the world to get the right result, but 2 and 3 are much more complex, especially number 3. Scope 3 upstream is difficult, as if the value chain is long and complex, tracking everything down is virtually impossible. And I can tell by experience that using average numbers, for example, the idea that we're buying screws and the average emission of screws is this and this many kilograms per kilogram, doesn't work. You have to go into the specific 3mm screws you're using of the specific material you're using from the specific factory. And now, if you look at this and think that you have to track thousands and thousands of different items through long value chains, you can see that it's extremely complicated. Companies very often resort to these average numbers, but they may give quite different results. Well, there are some parts of scope 3 which are easier, such as transportation of parts or products, because we have a direct say on it. For example, moving from air freight to land transportation may make a significant difference, and we really can do that. Downstream, so what we sell, the customer side, is also difficult because there is so much out of control. Often the CO2 footprint is due to electricity use. So if we sell a product to Sweden, it's a completely different story, about 1/10 of the emissions, from if we sold that same product to Germany, because the German electricity network is so much more polluting. Another peculiarity is the lifetime of product. Intuition would say that making long-living products would be better, but the consumption is calculated over the full lifetime, so if we double the lifetime of product, its emissions will double. So selling 20-year products for Germans is not a good choice. Also, SBTi is more difficult if you start from a lower emission level than if you start from a higher level, because you have a certain percentage you have to go down. You get punished for being efficient. Well, criticizing SBTi is thus easy and it needs some fixing, but it's the best available widely accepted system. At least for me, the journey with SBTi has been full of surprises, and creating the fine-grained carbon accounting has really been an eye-opener. And of course, the 4-letter acronyms are not all here. We have something like IFRS, ISSB accounting, which is international equivalent to EFRAG, ESRS, and so on and so forth. And remembering all this is extremely difficult and probably unnecessary. The regulation is a mess, and it's also a rapidly changing mess. This is a consultant's heaven, I'd say. But just to recap the most important content, please remember CSRD plus ESRS. Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the standards it's relying on. And the idea of double materiality in ESRS, so that you have to look at your business also from the opportunity point of view, and you have to look how you impact the world and how the world impacts your business. Then scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. What they mean, what are those emissions? Because those are terms you will encounter very often. One thing worth noting is that regulation is mostly about reporting. It's much less about doing. I don't know why, but it's probably because politicians find it easier to request papers from businesses than action. Hey, congratulations for bearing with me through all this bureaucracy this far. Now we're done with it. See you next time.